Welcome to Wordsmith Soundscapes, immersive classic sci-fi tales and beyond. Here, classic science fiction comes alive through stories that ignited dreams of the future. Prepare to embark on a voyage through narratives that continue to inspire and captivate. Without further ado, let Insidekick, by J.F. Bone, transport you into another world. Shifaz glanced furtively around the room, satisfied that it was empty except for Fred Kemmer and himself. He sidled up to the Earthman's desk and hissed conspiratorially in his ear, "Sir, this Johnson is a spy. Is it permitted to slay him?" "It is permitted," Kemmer said in a tone suitable to the gravity of the occasion. He watched humorlessly as the Antarian slithered out of the office with a flutter of colorful ceremonial robes. Both Kemmer and Shifaz had known for weeks that Johnson was a spy, but the native had to go through this insane rigmarole before the rules on Antar would allow him to act. At any rate, the formalities were over at last, and the affair should be satisfactorily ended before nightfall. Natives moved quickly enough. Once the preliminaries were concluded, Kemmer leaned back in his chair and sighed. Being the Interworld Corporation's local manager had more compensations than headaches, despite the rigid ritualism of native society. Since most of the local population was under his thumb, counterespionage was miraculously effective. This fellow Johnson, for instance, had been in Vaornia less than 3 weeks, and despite the fact that he was an efficient and effective snoop, he had been fingered less than 48 hours after his arrival in the city. Kemmer closed his eyes and let a smile cross his keen features. Under his administration, there would be a sharp rise in the mortality curve for spies detected in the Vaornia-Lagash-Timarg triangle. With the native judiciary firmly under IC control, the corporation literally had a free hand, providing it kept its nose superficially clean. And as for spies, they knew the chances they took and what the penalty could be for interfering with the normal operations of corporate business. Kemmer yawned, stretched, turned his attention to more important matters. Albert Johnson fumbled hopefully in the empty food container before tossing it aside. A plump, prosaic man of middle height. With a round, ingenuous face, Albert was as undistinguished as his name, a fact that made him an excellent investigator. But he was neither undistinguished nor unnoticed in his present position, although he had tried to carry it off by photographing the actions of the local sanitary processional like any tourist. He had been waiting near the Vaornia arm on the road that led to Lagash since early afternoon, and now it was nearly evening. He cursed mildly at the fact that the natives had no conception of time, a trait not exclusively Antarian, but one which was developed to a high degree on this benighted planet. And the fact that he was hungry didn't add to his good temper. Natives might be able to fast for a week without ill effects, but his chunky body demanded quantities of nourishment at regular intervals, and his stomach was protesting audibly at being empty. He looked around him, at the rutted road, and at the darkening Vaornia arm of the divan forest that bordered the roadway. The sanitary processional had completed the daily ritual of waste disposal, and the cart drivers and censer bearers were goading their patient Dax into a faster gait. It wasn't healthy to be too near the forest after the sun went down. The night beasts weren't particular about what or whom they ate. The Vaornies used the Vaornia arm as a dump for the refuse of the city, a purpose admirably apt, for the ever-hungry forest life seldom left anything uneaten by morning. And since Antarian towns had elaborate rituals concerning the disposal of waste, together with a non-existent sewage system, the native attitude of fatalistic indifference to an occasional tourist or Antarian being gobbled up by some nightmare denizen of the forest was understandable. The fact that the arm was also an excellent place to dispose of an inconvenient body didn't occur to Albert until the 3 natives with knives detached themselves from the rear of the sanitary processional and advanced upon him. They came from 3 directions, effectively boxing him in, and Albert realized with a sick certainty that he had been double-crossed, that Shifaz, instead of being an informant for him, was working for the IC. Albert turned to face the nearest native, tensing his muscles for battle. Then he saw the Zark. It stepped out of the gathering darkness of the forest, and with its appearance everything stopped. For perhaps a microsecond, the 3 Vaornies stood frozen. Then, with a simultaneous weep of terror, they turned and ran for the city. They might have stayed and finished their work if they had known it was a Zark, but at the moment the Zark was energizing a toothy horror that Earthmen called a bandersnatch, an insane combination of talons, teeth and snake-like neck mounted on a crocodilian body that exuded an odor of putrefaction from the carrion upon which it normally fed. The Bandersnatch had been dead for several hours, but neither the natives nor Albert knew that. It was a tribute to the Zark's ability to maintain pseudo-life in a Bandersnatch carcass that the knifemen fled, and a similar panic seized the late travelers on the road. Albert stared with horrified fascination at the monstrosity for several seconds before he, too, fled. Any number of natives with knives were preferable to a Bandersnatch. He had hesitated only because he didn't possess the conditioned reflexes arising from generations of exposure to Antarian wildlife. He was some 20 yards behind the rearmost native, and though not designed for speed, was actually gaining upon the fellow when his foot struck a loose cobblestone in the road. Arms flailing, legs pumping desperately to balance his toppling mass, Albert fought manfully against the forces of gravity and inertia. He lost. His head struck another upturned cobble. His body twitched once and then relaxed limply and unconscious upon the dusty road. The Zark winced a little at the sight, certain that this curious creature had damaged itself seriously. Filled with compassion, it started forward on the Bandersnatch's 4 walking legs, the grasping talons crossed on the breast in an attitude of prayer. The Zark wasn't certain what it could do, but perhaps it could help. Albert was mercifully unconscious as it bent over him to inspect his prone body with a purple-lidded pineal eye that was blue with concern. The Zark noted the bruise upon his forehead and marked his regular breathing, and came to the correct conclusion that, whatever had happened, the biped was relatively undamaged. But the Zark didn't go away. It had never seen a human in its 1,000-odd years of existence, which was not surprising since Earthmen had been on Antar less than a decade and Zark seldom left the forest. Albert began to stir before the Zark remembered its present condition. Not being a carnivore, it saw nothing appetizing about Albert, but it was energizing a Bandersnatch, and like all Zarks, it was a purist. A living Bandersnatch would undoubtedly drool happily at the sight of such a tempting tidbit, so the Zark opened the 3-foot jaws and drooled. Albert chose this precise time to return to consciousness. He turned his head groggily and looked up into a double row of saw-edged teeth surmounted by a leering triangle of eyes. A drop of viscid drool splattered moistly on his forehead, and as the awful face above him bent closer to his own, he fainted. The Zark snapped its jaws disapprovingly. This was not the proper attitude to take in the presence of a ferocious monster. One simply didn't go to sleep. One should attempt to run. The biped's act was utterly illogical. It needed investigation. Curiously, the Zark sent out a pseudopod of its substance through the open mouth of its disguise. The faintly glittering thread oozed downward and struck Albert's head beside his right eye. Without pausing, the thread sank through skin and connective tissue, circled the eyeball, and located the optic nerve. It raced inward along the nerve trunk, split at the optic chiasma, and entered the corpora quadrigemina, where it branched into innumerable microscopic filaments that followed the main neural paths of the man's brain, probing the major areas of thought and reflex. The Zark quivered with pleasure. The creature was beautifully complex and, more important, untenanted. He would make an interesting host. The Zark didn't hesitate. It needed a host. Giving its present mass of organic matter pseudo-life took too much energy. The Bandersnatch collapsed with a faint slurping sound. A blob of iridescent jelly flowed from the mouth and spread itself evenly over Albert's body in a thin layer. The jelly shimmered, glowed, disappeared inward through Albert's clothing and skin, diffusing through the subcutaneous tissues, sending hair-like threads along nerve trunks and blood vessels until the threads met other threads and joined, and the Zark became a network of protoplasmic tendrils that ramified through Albert's body. Immediately, the Zark turned its attention to the task of adapting itself to its new host. Long ago, it had learned that this had to be done quickly, or the host did not survive. And since the tissues of this new host were considerably different from those of the Bandersnatch, a great number of structural and chemical changes had to be made quickly. With some dismay, the Zark realized that its own stores of energy would be insufficient for the task. It would have to borrow energy from the host, which was a poor way to start a symbiotic relationship. Ordinarily, one gave before taking. Fortunately, Albert possessed considerable excess fat, an excellent source of energy whose removal would do no harm. There was plenty here for both Albert and itself. The man's body twitched and jerked as the Zark's protein cells passed through the adaptive process, and as the last leukocyte recoiled from tissue that had suddenly become normal, his consciousness returned. Less than 10 minutes had passed, but they were enough. The Zark was safely in harmony with its new host. Albert opened his eyes and looked wildly around. The landscape was empty of animate life, except for the odorous carcass of the Bandersnatch lying beside him. Albert shivered, rose unsteadily to his feet, and began walking toward Vaornia. That he didn't run was only because he couldn't. He found it hard to believe that he was still alive. Yet a hurried inspection convinced him that there wasn't a tooth mark on him. It was a miracle that left him feeling vaguely uneasy. He wished he knew what had killed that grinning horror so opportunely. But then, on second thought, maybe it was better that he didn't know. There might be things in the Divan Forest worse than a Bandersnatch. Inside the city walls, Vaornia struck a three-pronged blow at Albert's senses. Sight, hearing, and smell were assaulted simultaneously. Natives slithered past, garbed in long robes of garish color. Sibilant voices cut through the evening air like thin-edged knives, clashing against the grating screech of the ungreased wooden wheels of dak carts. Odors of smoke, cooking, spices, perfume, and corruption mingled with the all-pervasive musky stench of unwashed Vaornies' bodies. It was old to Albert, but new and exciting to the Zark. Its taps on Albert's sense organs brought a flood of new sensation the Zark had never experienced. It marveled at the crowded buildings, studded with jutting balconies and ornamental carvings. It stared at the dak caravans maneuvering with ponderous delicacy through the swarming crowds. It reveled in the colorful banners and awnings of the tiny shops lining the streets and the fluttering robes of the natives. Color was something new to the Zark. Its previous hosts had been color-blind, and the symbiont wallowed in an orgy of bright sensation. If Albert could have tuned in on his fellow travelers' emotions, he probably would have laughed. For the Zark was behaving precisely like the rubbernecking tourist he himself was pretending to be. But Albert wasn't interested in the sights, sounds, or smells, nor did the natives intrigue him. There was only one of them he cared to meet, that slimy double-crosser called Shifaz, who had nearly conned him into a one-way ticket. Albert plowed heedlessly through the crowd, using his superior mass to remove natives from his path. By completely disregarding the code of conduct outlined by the IC Travel Bureau, he managed to make respectable progress toward the enormous covered area in the center of town that housed the Kazlak, or native marketplace. Shifaz had a stand there where he was employed as a tourist guide. The Zark, meanwhile, was not idle despite the outside interests. The majority of its structure was busily engaged in checking and cataloging the body of its host, an automatic process that didn't interfere with the purely intellectual one of enjoying the new sensations. Albert's body wasn't in too bad shape. A certain amount of repair work would have to be done, but despite the heavy padding of fat, the organs were in good working condition. The Zark ruminated briefly over what actions it should take, as it dissolved a milligram of cholesterol out of Albert's aorta and strengthened the weak spot in the blood vessel with a few cells of its own substance, until Albert's tissues could fill the gap. Its knowledge of human physiology was incomplete, but it instinctively recognized abnormality. As a result, it could help the host's physical condition, which was a distinct satisfaction, for a Zark must be helpful. Shifaz was at his regular stand, practicing his normal profession of guide. As Albert approached, he was in the midst of describing the attractions of the No. 2 tour to a small knot of fascinated tourists. And then, in the center of the Kazlak, "We will come to the Hall of the Brides, Anter's greatest marriage market. It has been arranged for you to actually see a mating auction in progress, but we must hurry," or Shifaz looked up to see Albert shouldering the tourists aside. His yellow eyes widened and his hand darted to his girdle and came up with a knife. The nearest tourists fell back in alarm as he hissed malevolently at Albert, "Stand back, Earthman, or I'll let the life out of your scaleless carcass." "Double-crosser," Albert said, moving in. One meaty hand closed over the knife hand and wrenched while the other caught Shifaz alongside the head with a smack that sounded loud in the sudden quiet. Shifaz did a neat backflip and lay prostrate, the tip of his tail twitching reflexively. One of the tourists screamed. "No show today, folks," Albert said. "Shifaz has another engagement." He picked the Antarian up by a fold of his robe and shook him like a dirty dust cloth. A number of items cascaded out of hidden pockets, among which was an oiled silk pouch. Albert dropped the native and picked up the pouch, opened it, sniffed, and nodded. It fitted. Things were clearer now. He was still nodding when two Earthmen in IC uniforms stepped out of the crowd. "Sorry, sir," the bigger of the pair said, "but you have just committed a violation of the IC Anter Compact. I'm afraid we'll have to take you in." "This lizard tried to have me killed," Albert protested. "I wouldn't know about that." The IC man said, "You've assaulted a native, and that's a crime. You'd better come peaceably with us. Local justice is rather primitive and unpleasant. I'm an Earth citizen, Albert began. This world is on a commercial treaty. The guard produced a blackjack and tapped the shot-filled leather in his palm. It's our business to protect people like you from the natives, and if you insist, we'll use force. I don't insist, but I think you're being pretty high-handed. Your objection has been noted, the IC man said, and will be included in the official report. Now come along, or we'll be in the middle of a jurisdictional hassle when the native cops arrive. The corporation doesn't like hassles. They're bad for business. The two IC men herded him into a waiting ground car and drove away. It was all done very smoothly, quietly, and efficiently. The guards were good, and so was the local detention room. It was clean, modern, and Albert noted wryly, virtually escape-proof. Albert was something of an expert on jails, and the thick steel bars, the force lock, and the spy cell in the ceiling won his grudging respect. He sighed and sat down on the cot, which was the room's sole article of furniture. He had been a fool to let his anger get the better of him. IC would probably use this brush with Schiff as an excuse to send him back to Earth as an undesirable tourist, which would be the end of his mission here, and a black mark on a singularly unspotted record. Of course, they might not be so gentle with him if they knew that he knew they were growing tobacco. But he didn't think that they would know, and if they had checked his background, they would find that he was an investigator for the Revenue Service. Technically, criminal operations were not his affair. His field was tax evasion. He didn't worry too much about the fact that Shifaz had tried to kill him. On primitive worlds like this, that was a standard procedure. It was less expensive to kill an agent than bribe him or pay honest taxes. He was angry with himself for allowing the native to trick him. He shrugged. By all rules of the game, IC would now admit about a 2% profit on their operation rather than the 4% loss they had claimed, and pay up like gentlemen, and he would get skinned by the chief back at Earth Central for allowing IC to unmask him. His report on tobacco growing would be investigated, but with the sketchy information he possessed, his charges would be impossible to prove, and IC would have plenty of time to bury the evidence. If Earth Central hadn't figured that the corporation owed it some billion megacredits in back taxes, he wouldn't be here. He had been dragged from his job in the General Accounting Office. For every field man and ex-field man was needed to conduct the sweeping investigation. Every facet of the sprawling IC operation was being checked. Even minor and out-of-the-way spots like Anter were on the list, spots that normally demanded a cursory once-over by a second-class business technician. Superficially, Anter had the dull unimportance of an early penetration. There were the usual trading posts, pilot plants, wholesale and retail trade, and tourist and recreation centers, all designed to accustom the native inhabitants to the presence of Earthmen and their works, and set them up for the commercial kill after they had acquired a taste for the products of civilization. But although the total manpower and physical plant for a world of this size was right, its distribution was wrong. A technician probably wouldn't see it, but to an agent who had dealt with corporate operations for nearly a quarter of a century, the setup felt wrong. It was not designed for maximum return. The Vayornia-Lagash-Timarg triangle held even more men and material than Prime Base. That didn't make sense. It was inefficient, and IC was not noted for inefficiency. Not being oriented criminally, Albert found out Ike's real reason for concentration in this area only by absent-mindedly lighting a cigarette one day in Vayornia. He had realized almost instantly that this was a gross breach of outworld ethics and had thrown the cigarette away. It landed between a pair of Vayornis walking by. The two goggled at the cigarette, sniffed the smoke rising from it, and with simultaneous whistles of surprise bent over to pick it up. Their heads collided with some force. The cigarette tore in their greedy grasp as they hissed hatefully at each other for a moment, before turning hostile glares in his direction. From their expressions, they thought this was a low, earthy trick to rob them of their dignity. Then they stalked off, their neck scales ruffled in anger, shreds of the cigarette still clutched in their hands. Even Albert couldn't miss the implications. His tossing the butt away had produced the same reaction as a deck of morphine on a group of human addicts. Since IC wouldn't corrupt a susceptible race with tobacco when there were much cheaper legal ways, the logical answer was that it wasn't expensive on this planet, which argued that Anter was being set up for plantation operations, in which case tobacco addiction was a necessary prerequisite, and the concentration of IC population made sense. Now tobacco, as any Earthman knew, was the only monopoly in the Confederation, and Earth had maintained that monopoly by treaty and by force, despite numerous efforts to break it. There were some good reasons for the policy, ranging all the way from vice control to taxable income, but the latter was by far the most important. The revenue supported a considerable section of Earth Central, as well as the huge battle fleet that maintained peace and order along the space lanes and between the worlds. But a lightweight, high-profit item like tobacco was a constant temptation to any sharp operator who cared more for money than for law, and IC filled that definition perfectly. In the tax section's book, the Interworld Corporation was a corner-cutting, profit-grabbing Chrysler. Its basic character had been the same for 3 centuries, despite all the complete turnovers in staff. Albert grinned wryly. The old-timers were right when they made corporations legal persons. Cigarettes which cost 5 credits to produce and sold for as high as 200 would always interest a crook, and as a consequence, Earth Central was always investigating reports of illegal plantations. They were found and destroyed eventually, and the owners punished. But the catch lay in the word, eventually. And if the operator was a corporation, no regulatory agency in its right mind would dare apply the full punitive power of the law. In that direction lay political suicide, for nearly half the population of Earth got dividends or salaries from them. That, of course, was the trouble with corporations. They invariably grew too big and too powerful, but to break them up as the ancients did was to destroy their efficiency. What was really needed was a corporate conscience. Albert chuckled. That was a nice, unproductive thought. Fred Kemmer received the news that Albert had been taken to detention with a philosophic calm that lasted for nearly half an hour. By morning, the man would be turned over to the patrol in Prime Base. The patrol would support the charge that Albert was an undesirable tourist and send him home to Earth. But the philosophic calm departed with a frantic leap when Shifaz reported Johnson's inspection of the oiled silk pouch. Raw tobacco was something that shouldn't be within 1,000 parsecs of Antar. Its inference would be obvious even to an investigator interested only in tax revenues. Kemmer swore at the native. The entire operation would have to be aborted now, and his dreams of promotion would vanish. It wasn't my supply, Shifaz protested. I was carrying it down to Kara's at the mating market. He demands a pack every time he puts a show on for your silly earthy tourists. You should have concealed it better. How was I to know that chubby slob was coming back alive, and who'd have figured that he could handle me? I've told you time and again that Earthmen are tough customers when they get mad, but you had to learn it the hard way. Now we're all in the soup. The patrol doesn't like illicit tobacco planters. Tobacco is responsible for their pay. But he's still in your hands and he couldn't have had time to transmit his information, Shifaz said. You can still kill him. Kemmer's face cleared. Sure, that was it. Delay informing the patrol and knock the snoop off. The operation and Kemmer's future were still safe, but it irked him that he had panicked instead of thinking. It just went to show how being involved in major crime ruined the judgment. He'd have Johnson fixed up with a nice hearty meal, and he'd see that it was delivered personally. At this late date, he couldn't afford the risk of trusting a subordinate. Kemmer's glower became a smile. The snoop's dossier indicated that he liked to eat. He should die happy. With a faint click, a loaded tray passed through a slot in the rear wall of Albert Johnson's cell. The sight and smell of earthly cooking reminded him that he hadn't anything to eat for hours. His mouth watered as he lifted the tray and carried it to the cot. At least IC wasn't going to let him starve to death, and if this was any indication of the way they treated prisoners, an IC jail was the best place to be on this whole planet. Since it takes a little time for substances to diffuse across the intestinal epithelium and enter the circulation, the Zark had some warning of what was about to happen from the behavior of the epithelial cells lining Albert's gut. As a result, a considerable amount of the alkaloid was stopped before it entered Albert's body, but some did pass through, for the Zark was not omnipotent. For nearly 5 minutes after finishing the meal, Albert felt normally full and comfortable. Then hell broke loose. Most of the food came back with explosive violence, and cramps bent him double. The Zark turned to the neutralization and elimination of the poison. Absorptive surfaces were sealed off, body fluids poured into the intestinal tract, and anti-substances formed out of Albert's energy reserve to neutralize whatever alkaloid remained. None of the Zark's protective measures were normal to Albert's body, and with the abrupt depletion of blood glucose to supply the energy the Zark required, Albert passed into hypoglycemic shock. The Zark regretted that, but it had no time to utilize his other less readily available energy sources. In fact, there was no time for anything except the most elemental protective measures. Consequently, the convulsions, tachycardia, and coma had to be ignored. Albert's spasms were mercifully short, but when the Zark was finished, he lay unconscious on the floor, his body twitching with incoordinate spasms, while a frightened guard called in an alarm to the medics. The Zark quivered with its own particular brand of nausea. It had not been hurt by the alkaloid, but the pain of its host left it sick with self-loathing. That it had established itself in a life form that casually ingested deadly poisons was no excuse. It should have been more alert, more sensitive to the host's deficiencies. It had saved his life, which was some compensation, and there was much that could be done in the way of restorative and corrective measures that would prevent such a thing from occurring again. But the Zark was unhappy as it set about helping Albert's liver metabolize fat to glucose and restore blood sugar levels. The medic was puzzled. She had seen some peculiar conditions at this station, but hypoglycemic shock was something new, and being unsure of herself, she ordered Albert into the infirmary for observation. The guard, of course, didn't object, and Kemmer, when he heard of it, could only grind his teeth in frustration. He was on delicate enough ground without making it worse by not taking adequate precautions to preserve the health of his unwilling guest. Somehow that infernal snoop had escaped again. Albert moved his head with infinite labor and looked at the intravenous apparatus, dripping a colorless solution into the vein in the elbow joint of his extended left arm. He felt no pain, but his physical weakness was appalling. He could move only with the greatest effort, and the slightest exertion left him dizzy and breathless. It was obvious that he had been poisoned, and that it was a miracle of providence that he had survived. It was equally obvious that a reappraisal of his position was in order. Someone far higher up the ladder than Shifaz was responsible for this latest attempt on his life. The native couldn't possibly have reached him in the safety of Ike's jail. The implications were unpleasant. Someone important feared him enough to want him dead, which meant that his knowledge of illicit tobacco was not as secret as he thought. It would be suicide to stay in the hands of the IC any longer. Somehow he had to get out and inform the patrol. He looked at the intravenous drip despondently. If the solution was poisoned, there was no help for him. It was already half gone, but he didn't feel too bad. Outside of being weak, it probably was all right. In any event, he would have to take it. The condition of his body wouldn't permit anything else. He sighed and relaxed on the bed, aware of the drowsiness that was creeping over him. When he awoke, he would do something about this situation, but he was sleepy now. Albert awoke strong and refreshed. He was as hungry as he always was before breakfast. Whatever was in that solution, it had certainly worked miracles. As far as he could judge, he was completely normal. The medic was surprised to find him sitting up when she made her morning rounds. It was amazing, but this case was amazing in more ways than one. Last night, he had been in a state of complete collapse, and now he was well on the road to recovery. Albert looked at her curiously. "What was in that stuff you gave me?" "Just dextrose and saline," she said. "I couldn't find anything wrong with you except hypoglycemia and dehydration, so I treated that." She paused and eyed him with a curiosity equal to his own. "Just what do you think happened?" she asked. "I think I was poisoned. That's impossible." "Possibly," Albert conceded, "but it might be an idea to check that food I left all over the cell. That was cleaned up hours ago." "Convenient, isn't it?" "I don't know what you mean by that," she said. "Someone in the kitchens might have made a mistake, yet you were the only case." She looked thoughtful. "I think I will do a little checking in the central kitchen, just to be on the safe side." She smiled a bright professional smile. "Anyway, I'm glad to see that you have recovered so well. I'm sure you can go back tomorrow." She vanished through the door with a rustle of white dacron. Albert, after listening a moment to make sure that she was gone, rose to his feet and began an inspection of his room. It wasn't a jail cell, not quite, but it wasn't designed for easy escape either. It was on the top floor of the IC building, a good 100 feet down to the street below. The window was covered with a steel grating and the door was locked. But both window and door were designed to hold a sick man rather than a healthy and desperate one. Albert looked out of the window. The building was constructed to harmonize with native structures surrounding it, so the outer walls were studded with protuberances and bosses that would give adequate handholds to a man strong enough to brave the terrors of the descent. Looking down the wall, Albert wavered. Thinking back, he made up his mind. Fred Kemmer was disturbed. By all the rules, Albert Johnson should be dead, but Shifaz had failed and that fool guard had to call in the medics. It was going to be harder to get at Johnson, now that he was in the infirmary, but he had to be reached. One might buy off an agent who was merely checking on tax evasion, but tobacco was another matter entirely. Kemmer wished he hadn't agreed to boss Operation Weed. The glowing dreams of promotion and fortune were beginning to yellow around the edges. Visions of the penal colony bothered him, for if the operation went sour, he would do the paying. He had known that when he took the job, but the possibility seemed remote then. He shook his head. It wasn't that bad yet. As long as Johnson hadn't communicated with anyone else, and as long as he was still in company hands, something could be done. Kemmer thought a while, trying to put himself in Johnson's place. Undoubtedly the spy was frightened, and undoubtedly he would try to escape. And since it would be far easier to escape from the infirmary than it would be from detention, he would try as soon as possible. Kemmer's face cleared. If Johnson tried it, he would find it wasn't as easy as he thought. With characteristic swiftness, Kemmer outlined his plans and made the necessary arrangements. A guard was posted in the hall with orders to shoot if Johnson tried the door of his room, and Kemmer himself took a stand in the building across the street, facing the hospital, where he could watch the window of Albert's room. As he figured it, the window was the best bet. He stroked the long-barreled blaster lying beside him. Johnson still hadn't a chance, but these delays in disposing of him were becoming an annoyance. Cautiously, Albert tried the grating that covered the window. The Antarian climate had rusted the heavy screws that fastened it to the casing. One of the bars was loose. If it could be removed, it would serve as a lever to pry out the entire grating. Albert twisted at the bar. It groaned and squealed. He nervously applied more pressure, and the bar moved slowly out of its fastenings. The Zark observed his actions curiously. Now why was its host twisting that rod of metal out of the woodwork? It didn't know, and it was consumed with curiosity. It had found no way to communicate with its host, so that some of the man's queer actions could be understood. In the portions of the brain it had explored, there were no portals of communication. However, there still was a large dormant portion, and perhaps here lay the thing it sought. The Zark inserted a number of tendrils into the blank areas, probing, connecting synapses, opening unused pathways, looking for what it hoped existed. The results of this action were completely unforeseen by the Zark, for it was essentially just a subordinate ego with all the lacks which that implied, and it had never before inhabited a body that possessed a potentially first-class brain. With no prior experience to draw upon, the Zark couldn't possibly guess that its actions would result in a peculiar relationship between the man and the world around him. And if the Zark had known, it probably wouldn't have cared. Albert removed the bar and pried out the grating. With only a momentary hesitation, he lowered himself over the sill until his feet struck an ornamental knob on the wall. He glanced quickly down. There was another protuberance about 2 feet below the one on which he was standing. Pressing against the wall, he inched 1 foot downward until it found the foothold. With relief, he shifted his weight to the lower foot, and as he did, a wave of heat enveloped his legs. The protuberance came loose from the wall with a grating noise mixed with the crackling hiss of a blaster bolt, and Albert plunged toward the street below. As the pavement rushed at him, he had time for a brief, fervent wish that he were someplace else. Then the thought was swallowed in an icy blackness. Fred Kemmer lowered the blaster with a grin of satisfaction. He had figured his man correctly, and now the spy would be nothing to worry about. He watched the plummeting body and gasped with consternation. For less than 10 feet above the pavement, Albert abruptly vanished. There is such a thing as too much surprise, too much shock, too much amazement. And that precisely was what affected Albert when he found himself standing on the street where the IC guards had picked him up. By rights, he should have been a pulpy smear against the pavement beneath the infirmary window. But he was not. He didn't question why he was here, or consider how he had managed to avoid the certain death that waited for him. The fact was that he had done it somehow, and that was enough. It was almost like history repeating itself. Shiffaz was at his usual stand haranguing another group of tourists. It was the same spiel as before, and almost at the same point of the pitch. But his actions upon seeing Albert were entirely different. His eyes widened, but this time he slid quietly from his perch on the cornerstone of the building and disappeared into the milling crowd. Albert followed. The fact that Shiffaz was somewhere in that crowd was enough to start him moving, and once started, stubbornness kept him going, plowing irresistibly through the thick swarm of Vaornis. Reason told him that no Earthman could expect to find a native hidden among hundreds of his own kind. Their bipedal dinosaur-like figures seemed to be cast out of one mold. A chase through this crowd was futile, but he went on deeper into the Kazlak, drawn along an invisible trail by some unearthly sense that told him he was right. He was as certain of it as that his name was Albert Johnson. And when he finally cornered Shifaz in a deserted alley, he was the one who was not surprised. Shifaz squawked and darted toward Albert, a knife glittering in his hand. Albert felt a stinging pain across the muscles of his left arm as he blocked the thrust aimed at his belly, wrenched the knife from the native's grasp, and slammed him to the pavement. Shifaz bounced like a rubber ball, but he had no chance against the bigger and stronger Earthman. Albert knocked him down again. This time the native didn't rise. He lay in the street, a trickle of blood oozing from the corner of his lipless mouth, hate radiating from him in palpable waves. Albert stood over him, panting a little from the brief but violent scuffle. "Now, Shifaz, you're going to tell me things," he said heavily. "You can go to your place of punishment," Shifaz snarled. "I shall say nothing." "I can beat the answers out of you," Albert mused aloud, "but I won't. I'll just ask you questions, and every time I don't like your answer, I'll kick one of your teeth out. If you don't answer, I guarantee that you'll look like an old grandmother." Shifaz turned a paler green. To lose one's teeth was a punishment reserved only for females. He would be a thing of mockery and laughter, but there were worse things than losing teeth or face. There was such a thing as losing one's life, and he knew what would happen if he betrayed IC. Then he brightened. He could always lie, and this hulking brute of an Earthman couldn't possibly know, so he nodded with a touch of artistic reluctance. "All right," he said, "I'll talk." He injected a note of fear into his voice. It wasn't hard to do. "Where did you get that tobacco?" Albert asked. "From a farm," Shifaz said. That was the truth. The Earthman probably knew about tobacco, and there was no need to lie yet. "Where is it?" Shifaz thought quickly of the clearing in the forest south of Lagash where the green, broad-leaved plants were grown, and said, "It's just outside of Timarg, along the road which runs south." He waited tensely for Albert's reaction, wincing as the Earthman drew his foot back. Timarg was a good 50 miles from Lagash, and if this lie went over, he felt that he could proceed with confidence. It went over. Albert replaced his foot on the ground. "You telling the truth? As Merg is my witness," Shifaz said with sincerity. Albert nodded, and Shifaz relaxed with hidden relief. Apparently the man knew that Merg was the most sacred and respected deity in the pantheon of Antar, and that oaths based upon his name were inviolable. But what the scaleless oaf didn't know was that this applied to Antarians only. As far as these strangers from another world were concerned, anything went. So Albert continued questioning, and Shifaz answered, sometimes readily, sometimes reluctantly, telling the truth when it wasn't harmful, lying when necessary. The native's brain was fertile, and the tissue of lies and truth hung together well, and Albert seemed satisfied. At any rate, he finally went away, leaving behind a softly whistling Veornese, who congratulated himself on the fact that he had once more imposed upon this outlander's credulity. He was so easy to fool that it was almost a crime to do it. But he wouldn't have been so pleased with himself if he could have seen the inside of Albert's mind. For Albert knew the truth about the 400-acre farm south of Lagash. He knew about the hidden curing sheds and processing plant. He knew that both Veornese and Lagashites were deeply involved in something they called Operation Weed, and approved of it thoroughly, either from sheer cussedness or addiction. He had quietly read the native's mind, while the half-truths and lies had fallen from his forked tongue. And catching Shifaz's last thought, Albert couldn't help chuckling. At one of the larger intersections, Albert stopped under a flaming cresset and looked at his arm. There was a wide red stain that looked black against the whiteness of his pajamas. That much blood meant more than a scratch, even though there was no pain, and cuts on this world could be deadly if they weren't attended to promptly. He suddenly felt alone and helpless, wishing desperately for a quiet place where he could dress his wound and be safe from the eyes he knew were inspecting him. He was too conspicuous. The pajamas were out of place on the street. Undoubtedly, natives were hurrying to report him to the IC. His mind turned to his room in the hostel with its well-fitted wardrobe and its first aid kit, and again came that instant of utter darkness. And then he was standing in the middle of his room, facing the wardrobe that held his clothing. He felt no surprise this time. He knew what had happened. Something within his body was acting like a tiny distorter, transporting him through hyperspace in the same manner that a starship's engine room warped it through the folds of the normal space-time continuum. There was nothing really strange about it. It was a power which any normal man should have. The fact that he didn't have it before was of no consequence, and the fact that other men didn't have it now merely made them abnormal. He smiled as he considered the possibilities which these new powers gave him. They were enormous, At the very least, they tripled his value as an agent. Nothing was safe from his investigation. The most secret hiding places were open to his probings. Nothing could stop him, for command of hyperspace made a mockery of material barriers. He chuckled happily as he removed his pajama jacket and reached for the first aid kit. From the gash in his sleeve, there should be a nasty cut underneath, and it startled him a little that there was no greater amount of hemorrhage. He cleaned off the dried blood and found nothing underneath except a thin red bloodless line that ran halfway around his arm. It wasn't even a scratch. Yet he had felt Shifa's blade slice into his flesh. He knew there was more damage than this. The blood and the slashed sleeve could tell him that, even if he didn't have the messages of his nerves. Yet now there was no pain, and the closed scratch certainly wasn't the major wound he had expected. And this was queer, a fact for which he had no explanation. Albert frowned. Maybe this was another facet of the psi factors that had suddenly become his. He wondered where they had come from. Without warning, he had become able to read minds with accuracy and do an effective job of teleportation. About the only things he lacked to be a well-rounded psi were telekinetic powers and precognition. His frown froze on his face as he became conscious of a sense of unease. They were coming down the hall, 2 IC guardsmen. He caught the doubt and certainty in their minds, doubt that he would be in his room, certainty that he would be ultimately caught. For on Antor, there was no place for an Earthman to hide. Albert slipped into the first suit that came to hand, blessing the seam tabs that made dressing a moment's work. As the guards opened the door, he visualized the spot on the Lagash Road where he had encountered the Bandersnatch. It was easier than before. He was standing in the middle of the road, the center of the surprised attention of a few travelers, when the guards entered his room. The bright light of Antor's golden day came down from a cloudless yellow sky. In the forest strip ahead, Albert could hear a faint medley of coughs, grunts, and snarls as the lesser beasts fed upon the remains of yesterday's garbage. Albert moved down the road, ignoring the startled natives. This time he wasn't afraid of meeting a Bandersnatch or anything else, for he had a method of escape that was foolproof. Lagash was some 30 miles ahead, but in the lighter gravity of Antor, the walk would be stimulating rather than exhausting. He went at a steady pace, occasionally turning his glance to the road, impressing sections of it upon his memory so that he could return to them via teleport if necessary. He found that he could memorize with perfect ease. Even the positions of clumps of grass and twigs were remembered with perfect clarity and in minute detail. The perfection of his memory astonished and delighted him. The Zark felt pleased with itself. Although it had never dreamed of the potential contained in the host's mind, it realized that it was responsible for the release of these weird powers, and it enjoyed the new sensations and was eager for more. If partial probing could achieve so much, what was the ultimate power of this remarkable mind? The Zark didn't know, but like a true experimenter, it was determined to find out, so it probed deeper, opening still more pathways and connecting more synapses with the conscious brain. It was routine work that could be performed automatically, while the rest of the Zark enjoyed the colorful beauty of the Antarian scenery. With the forest quickly left behind him, Albert walked through gently rolling grassland dotted with small farms and homesteads. It was a peaceful scene, similar to many he had seen on Earth, and the familiarity brought a sense of nostalgic longing to be home again. But the feeling was not too strong, more intellectual than physical, for the memories of Earth were oddly blurred. Time passed and the road unreeled behind him. Once he took to the underbrush to let a humming IC ground car pass, and twice more he hid as airboats swept by overhead, but the annoyances were minor and unimportant. When hiding from the second airboat, he disturbed a kellet in the thick brush growing beside the road. The little insect eater chittered in alarm and dashed off to safety across the highway. And Albert, looking at it, was conscious not only of the external shape, but the internal as well. He could see its little heart pounding in its chest, and the pumping bellows of the pink lungs that surrounded it. He was aware of the muscles pulling and relaxing as the kellet ran, and the long bones sliding in their lubricated joints. He saw the tenseness of the abdominal organs, felt the blind fear in the creature's mind. The totality of his impressions washed through him with a clear wave of icy shock. Grimly, he shrugged it off. He had ESP. He ought to have expected it. It was the next logical step. He scrambled back to the road and walked onward a little faster, until the battlements of Lagash came in sight. The Lagash arm was farther from the city than was that of Vaornia, and as he came to the strip of jungle, he turned his eyes upon the empty park-like arcades between the trees. The last edible garbage had long since been consumed, and the greater and lesser beasts had departed for the cooler depths of the forest. But Albert was conscious of life. It was all around him, in the trees with the ringed layers of their trunks, and the sap flowing slowly upward through the cambium layer beneath their scaly bark, in the insects feeding upon the nectar of the aerial vine blossoms, in the rapid photosynthetic reactions of the leaves. His gaze, turning aloft, was conscious of the birds and the tiny arboreal mammals. He saw the whole forest with eyes filled with wonder at its life and beauty. It was the only right way to see. At the proper distance from Lagash, he plunged off boldly across country and entered the main area of the forest, reflecting wryly as he did so that he was probably the first human in the short history of Antarian exploration who had gone into one of the great forests with absolute knowledge that he would come out of it alive. And as so often happens to men who have no fear, trouble avoided him. He followed the directions he had obtained from Shifaz and found the plantation without trouble. He could hardly miss it, because its size was far from accurately expressed in the native's memory. Skillfully concealed beneath an overhanging network of aerial vines whose camouflage made it invisible from the air, concealing the tobacco plants from casual detector search. The plantation extended in row upon narrow row, the irregular strips of fields separated by rows of trees from which the camouflage was hung. A fragile electric fence encircled the area, a seemingly weak defense, but one through which even the greatest Antarian beast would not attempt to pass. Albert whistled softly under his breath at what he saw, recorded it in his memory. Then, having finished the eyewitness part of his task, he recalled a section of road over which he had passed and pushed. The return journey to Vaornia was experimental in nature, as Albert tried the range of his powers. His best was just short of 20 miles, and the journey which had taken him 8 hours was made back in somewhat less than 20 minutes, counting half a dozen delays and backtracks. There was no question about where Albert would go next. He had to get evidence, and that evidence lay in only one place in the local office of the Interworld Corporation in Vaornia. A moment later, he stood in the reception room looking across the empty desks at the bright square of light shining through the glassite-paneled door of Fred Kemmer's office. It was past closing hours, but Kemmer had a right to be working late. Right now, he was probably sweating blood at the thought of what would happen if Albert had finally managed to escape him. The corporation would virtuously disown him and leave him to face a 10-year rap in penal colony. Albert almost felt sorry for him. Albert let his perception sense travel through the wall and into Kemmer's room. His guess was right, the local boss was sweating. He checked Kemmer's office swiftly, but the only thing that interested him was the big vault beside the desk. He visualized the interior of the vault and pushed himself inside. Separated from Kemmer by 6 inches of the hardest metal known to man, he quietly leafed through the files of confidential correspondence until he found what he wanted. He didn't need a light. His perception worked as well in the dark as in the daylight. There was enough documentary evidence in the big vault to indict quite a few more IC officials than Kemmer, and perhaps investigation of their files would provide more leads to even higher officials. Wherever Kemmer was going, Albert had the idea that he wouldn't be going alone. Albert selected all the incriminating letters and documents he could find and packed the microfiles in his jacket. Finally, bulging with documentary information, he pushed back into the streets. It was late enough for few natives to be on the streets, and his appearance caused no comment. Apparently unnoticed, he moved rapidly into the Kazlak, searching for a place to hide the papers he had stolen. What he had learned of Vaornia made him cautious. He checked constantly for spies, but there wasn't a native in sensing range. He ducked into the alleyway where he had caught Shifaz. His memory of it had been right. There was a small hole in one of the building walls, partly covered with cracked plaster and barely visible in the darkness. The gloom of the Kazlak scarcely varied with night or day, as the enormous labyrinth of covered passages and building walls was pierced with only a few ventilation holes. Cressets at the main intersections burned constantly, their smokeless flames lighting the streets poorly. He wondered idly how he had managed to remember the way to this place, let alone the little hole in the wall, as he stuffed the microfiles into its dark interior. He finished, turned to leave, and was out on the main tunnel before he became aware of the IC ground cars closing in upon him. The corporation was really on the beam, their spies everywhere, but they didn't know his abilities. He visualized and pushed. They were going to be surprised when he vanished, but he didn't vanish. The expression of shocked surprise was still on his face as the stat gun blast took him squarely in the chest. He He was tied to a chair in Fred Kemmer's office. He recognized it easily, although physically he had never been inside the room. His head hurt as a polygraph recorder was strapped to his left arm, and behind him, beyond his range of vision, he could sense another man and several machines. In front of him stood Fred Kemmer, with an expression of satisfaction on his face. "Don't start thinking you're smart," Kemmer said. "You're in no position for it. You've tried to kill me 3 times, Albert reminded him. "There's always a 4th time." "I don't think so. Too many people know." "Precisely my own conclusion," Kemmer said, "but there are other ways. Brainwashing's a good one." "That's illegal," Albert protested. "Besides, so what?" Kemmer cut him off. "It's an illegal universe." Albert probed urgently at the icy man's mind, hoping to find something he could turn to his advantage. But all he found were surface thought satisfaction at having gotten the spy where he could do no harm, plans for turning Albert into a mindless idiot, thoughts of extracting information, all of which had an air of certainty that was unnerving. Albert had badly underestimated him. It was high time to leave here, if he could. Albert visualized an area outside Vaornia, and as he tried to push, a machine hummed loudly behind him. He didn't move. "Mistake," Albert thought worriedly. "I'm not going anywhere, and he knows I'm scared." "It won't do you any good," Kemmer said. "It didn't take too much brains to figure you were using hyperspace in those disappearing acts. There's an insulating field around that chair that'd stop a space yacht." He leaned forward. "Now what are your contacts, and who gave you the information on where to look?" Albert saw no reason to hide it, but there was no sense in revealing anything. The patrol had word of his arrest by now and should be here any moment. It was as though Kemmer had read his mind. "Don't count on being rescued. I stopped the patrol report." Kemmer paused, obviously enjoying the expression on Albert's face. "You know," he went on, "there's a peculiar fact about nerves that maybe you don't know. A stimulus sets up a brief neural volley lasting about 1/100th of a second. Following that comes a period of refractivity lasting perhaps 1/10th of that time while the nerve repolarizes. And then, immediately after repolarization, there's an extremely short period of hypersensitivity." "What's that to do with me?" Albert asked. "You'll find out if you don't answer promptly and truthfully. That gadget on your arm is connected to a polygraph. Now do you want to make a statement?" Albert shook his head. He was conscious of a brief pain in one finger, and the next instant someone tore the finger out of his hand with red-hot pincers. He screamed. He couldn't help it. This punishment was beyond agony. "Nice, isn't it?" Kemmer asked as Albert looked down at his amputated finger that still was remarkably attached to his hand. "And the beauty of it is that it doesn't even leave a mark. Of course, if it's repeated enough, it will end up as a permanent paralysis of the part stimulated. Now, once again, who gave you that information?" Albert talked. It was futile to try to deceive a polygraph, and he wanted no more of that nerve treatment. And then he looked into Kemmer's mind again and discovered what went into brainwashing. The shock was like ice water. Hypersensitive stimulation, Kemmer was thinking gleefully, would reduce this fat slob in the chair to a screaming, mindless lump that could be molded like wet putty. Albert felt helpless. He couldn't run and he couldn't fight, but he wasn't ready to give up. His perception passed over and through Kemmer with microscopic care, looking for some weakness, something that could be exploited to advantage. Kemmer had to have a vulnerable point. He did. There was a spot on the inner lining of the radial vein in Kemmer's left arm. He had recently received an inoculation, one of the constant immunizing injections that were necessary on Anter, for there was a small thrombus clinging to the needle puncture on the inner wall of the vessel. Normally, it was unimportant and would pass away in time and be absorbed, but there were considerable possibilities for trouble in that little blob of red cells and fibrin if they could be loosened from their attachment to the wall. Hopefully, Albert reached out. If he couldn't move himself, perhaps he could move the clot. The thrombus stirred and came free, rushing toward Kemmer's heart. Albert followed it, watching as it passed into the pulmonary artery, tracing it out through the smaller vessels until it stopped squarely across a junction of 2 arterioles. Kemmer coughed, his face whitening with pain as he clutched at his chest. The pain was a mild repayment for his recent agony, Albert thought grimly. A pulmonary embolism shouldn't kill him, but the effects were disproportionate to the cause and would last a while. He grinned mercilessly as Kemmer collapsed. A man darted from behind the chair and bent over Kemmer. Fumbling in his haste, he produced a pocket communicator, stabbed frantically at the dial and spoke urgently into it. "Medic, boss's office, hurry." For a second, Albert didn't realize that the hum of machinery behind him had stopped, but when he did, both Albert and the chair vanished. The Zark realized that its host had been hurt again. It was infuriating to be so helpless. Things kept happening to Albert which it couldn't correct until too late. There were forces involved that it didn't know how to handle. They were entirely outside the Zark's experience. It only felt relief when Albert managed to regain his ability to move, and as it looked out upon the familiar green Antarian countryside, it felt almost happy. Of course, Albert was probably still in trouble, but it wasn't so bad now. At least the man was away from the cause of his pain. It was a hell of a note, Albert reflected, sitting beside the road that led to Lagash and working upon the bonds that tied him to the chair. He had managed to get out of Kemmer's hands, but it appeared probable that he would get no farther. As things stood, he couldn't transmit the information he had gained, and by this time probably every IC office on the planet was alerted to the fact that Earth Central had a Psi-type agent on Antar 1 who was not inherently unstable, like those poor devils in the parapsychological laboratories on Earth. They would be ready for him with everything from distorter screens to Kelly's. He didn't underestimate IC now. Whatever its morals might be, its personnel was neither stupid nor slow to act. He was trapped in this sector of the planet. Prime Base was over 1,000 miles away, and even if he did manage to make his way back to it along the trade routes, it was a virtual certainty that he would never be able to get near a Class I communicator or the patrol office. IC would have ample time to get ready for him, and no matter what powers he possessed, a single man would have no chance against the mass technology of the corporation. However, he could play tag with IC in this area for some time with the reasonable possibility that he wouldn't get caught. If nothing else, it would have nuisance value. He pulled one hand free of the tape that held it to the chair arm and swiftly removed the rest of the tape that bound him. He had his freedom again. Now what would he do with it? He left the chair behind and started down the road toward Lagash. There was no good reason to head in that particular direction, but at the moment, one direction was as good as another until he could plan a course of action. His brain felt oddly fuzzy. He didn't realize that he had reached the end of his strength until he dropped in the roadway. To compensate for the miserable job it had done in protecting him from poison and neural torture, the Zark had successfully managed to block hunger and fatigue pains until Albert's overtaxed body could stand no more. It realized its error after Albert collapsed. Sensibly, it did nothing. Its host had burned a tremendous amount of energy without replenishment, and he needed time to rest and draw upon less available reserves, and to detoxify and eliminate the metabolic poisons in his body. It was late that afternoon before Albert recovered enough to take more than a passing interest in his surroundings. He had a vague memory of hiring a DAC cart driver to take him down the road. The memory was apparently correct, because he was lying in the back of a cargo cart piled high with short pieces of cane. The cart was moving at a brisk pace, despite the apparently leisurely movements of the DAC between the shafts. The ponderous 10-foot strides ate up distance. He was conscious of a hunger that was beyond discomfort, and a thirst that left his mouth dry and cottony. It was as though he hadn't eaten or drunk for days. He felt utterly spent, drained beyond exhaustion. He was in no shape to do anything, and unless he managed to find food and drink pretty soon, he would be easy pickings for IC. He looked around the cart, but there was nothing except the canes on which he lay. There wasn't even any of the foul porridge-like mess that the natives called food, since native workers didn't bother about eating during working hours. He turned over slowly, feeling the hard canes grind into his body as he moved. He kept thinking about food, about meals aboard ship, about dinners, about Earth restaurants, about steak, potatoes, bread, solid, heartening foods filled with proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, the thought stuck in his mind for some reason. And then he realized why. The canes he was lying on in the cart were sugar cane. He had never seen them on Earth, but he should have expected to find them out here. One of Earth's greatest exports was the seeds from which beet and cane sugar were obtained. He pulled a length of cane from the pile and bit into one end. His depleted body reached eagerly for the sweet energy that filled his mouth. With the restoration of his energy balance came clearer and more logical thought. It might be well enough to make IC spend valuable time looking for him, but such delaying actions had no positive value. Ultimately, he would be caught, and his usefulness would disappear with his death. But if he could get word to the patrol, this whole business could be smashed. Now, if he made a big enough disturbance, it might possibly even reach the noses of the patrol. Perhaps by working through the 100 or so tourists in Vaornia and Lagash, he could. That was it. The only possible solution. The IC might be able to get rid of one man, but it couldn't possibly get rid of 100, and somewhere in that group of tourists, there would be one who'd talk, someone who would pass the word. IC couldn't keep this quiet without brainwashing the lot of them, and that in itself would be enough to bring a patrol ship here at maximum blast. He chuckled happily. The native driver, startled at the strange sound, turned his head just in time to see his passenger vanish, together with a bundle of cane. The native shook his head in an oddly human gesture. These foreigners were strange creatures indeed. Albert, thin, pale, but happy, sat at a table in one of the smaller cafeterias in Earth Center, talking to the chief over a second helping of dessert. The fearful energy drain of a spur activity, combined with the constant dodging to avoid IC hunting parties, had made him a gaunt shadow, but he had managed to survive until a patrol ship arrived to investigate the strange stories told by tourists of a man who haunted the towns of Lagash and Vayornia and the road between. That's all there was to it, sir, Albert concluded. Once I figured it out that not even IC could get away with mass murder, it was easy. I just kept popping up in odd places and telling my story. And then, to make it impressive, I'd disappear. I had nearly 2 days before IC caught on, and by then you knew. The only trouble was getting enough to eat. I damn near starved before the patrol arrived. I expect that we owe quite a few farmers and shopkeepers reparations for the food I stole. They'll be paid, providing they present a claim, the chief said. But there's one thing about all this that bothers me. I know you had no psi powers when you left Earth on this mission. Just where did you acquire them? Albert shook his head. I don't know, he said, unless they were latent and developed in Anter's peculiar climatic and physical conditions. Or maybe it was the shock of that meeting with the Bandersnatch. All I'm sure of is that I didn't have any until after that meeting with Shifaz. Well, you certainly have them now. The parapsych boys are hot on your tail, but we've stalled them off. Thanks, I don't want to imitate a guinea pig. We owe you at least that for getting us a case against IC. Even their shysters won't be able to wiggle out of this one. The chief smiled. It's nice to have those lads where they can be handled for a change. They do need a dose of applied conscience, Albert agreed. The government also owes you a bonus and a vote of thanks. I'll appreciate the bonus, Albert said as he signaled for the waitress. Recently, I can't afford my appetite. It's understandable. After all, you've lost nearly 80 pounds. Wonder if I'll ever get them back, Albert muttered as he bit into the third dessert. The chief watched enviously. I wouldn't worry about that, he said. Just get your strength back. There's another assignment for you, one that will need your peculiar talents. He stood up. I'll be seeing you. My ulcer can't take your appetite anymore. He walked away. Inside Albert, the Zark alerted. A new assignment. That meant another world and new sensations. Truly, this host was magnificent. It had been a lucky day when he had fallen in running from the Bandersnatch. The Zark quivered with delight, and Albert felt it. Turning his perception inward to see what might be wrong, he saw the Zark for the first time. For a second, a wave of repulsion swept through his body, but as he comprehended the extent of that protoplasmic mass so inextricably intertwined with his own, he realized that this thing within him was the reason for his new powers. There could be no other explanation, and as he searched farther, he marveled. The Zark was unspecialized. In a way, he had never imagined an amorphous aggregation of highly evolved cells that could imitate normal tissues in a manner that would defy ordinary detection. It was something at once higher yet lower than his own flesh, something more primitive yet infinitely more evolved. The Zark had succeeded at last. It had established communication with its host. Answer me, parasite, Albert muttered subvocally. I know you're there, and I know you can answer. The Zark gave the protean equivalent of a shrug. If Albert only knew how it had tried to communicate no, there was no communication between them. Their methods of thought were so different that there was no possible rapport. It twitched and Albert jumped. And for the first time in its long life, the Zark had an original idea. It moved a few milligrams of its substance to Albert's throat region, and after a premonitory glottal spasm, Albert said very distinctly and quite involuntarily, "All right, I am here." Albert froze with surprise, but when the shock passed, he laughed. Well, I asked for it, he said. But it's like the story about the man who talked to himself and got answers. Not exactly a comforting sensation. I'm sorry, the Zark apologized. I do not wish to cause discomfort. You pick a poor way to keep from doing it. It was the only way I could figure to make contact with your conscious mind, and you desired that I communicate. I suppose you're right. But while it is nice to know that I really have a guardian angel, I'd have felt better about it if you had white robes and wings and were hovering over my shoulder. I don't understand, the Zark said. I was trying to be funny. You know, Albert continued after a moment, I never thought of trying to perceive myself. I wonder why. I guess because none of the medical examinations showed anything different from normal. I was always afraid that you might suspect before I could tell you, the Zark replied. It was an obvious line of reasoning, and you are an intelligent entity, the most intelligent I have ever inhabited. It is too bad that I shall have to leave. I have enjoyed being with you. Who said anything about leaving? Albert asked. You did. I could feel your revulsion when you became aware of me. It wasn't nice, but I suppose you can't help it. Yours is an independent race, one that doesn't willingly support. The voice hesitated, as though searching for the proper word. Fellow travelers, it finished. Albert grinned. There are historical precedents for that statement, but your interpretation isn't quite right. I was surprised. You startled me. He fell silent, and the Zark, respecting the activity of his mind, forbore to interrupt. Albert was doing some heavy thinking about the Zark. Certainly it had protected him on Antor, and with equal certainty it must have been responsible for the psi powers he possessed. He owed it a lot, for without its help he wouldn't have survived. There was only one thing wrong. Sexless though it was, the Zark must possess the characteristics of life, since it was obviously alive. And those characteristics were unchanging throughout the known universe. The 4 vital criteria defined centuries ago were still as good today as they were then: growth, metabolism, irritability, and reproduction. Despite its lack of sex, the Zark must be capable of producing others of its kind, and while he didn't mind supporting one fellow traveler, he was damned if he'd support a whole family of them. That need never bother you, the Zark interrupted. As an individual, I am very long-lived and seldom reproduce. I can, of course, but the process is quite involved. Actually, it involves making a twin out of myself, and it is not necessary. Besides, there cannot be 2 Zarks in one host. My offspring would have to seek another. And do they have your powers? Of course, they would know all I know, for Zark's memory is not concentrated in specialized tissue like your brain. A light began to dawn in Albert's mind. Maybe this was the answer to the corporate conscience he had been wishing for so wistfully on Antor. Does it bother you to reproduce? He asked. It is annoying, but not painful, nor would it be too difficult after a pattern was set in my cells. But why do you ask this? The thought just occurred to me that there are quite a few people who could use a Zark. A few of the more honest folks would improve this confederation's moral tone if they had the power, and certainly psi powers in law enforcement would be unbeatable. Then you would want me to reproduce. It might be a good idea if we can find men who are worthy of Zarks. I could check them with my telepathy, and perhaps we might. Let me warn you. The Zark interjected. While this all sounds very fine, there are difficulties, even with a host as large as yourself. I shall need more energy than your body has available in order to duplicate myself. It will be hard for you to do what must be done. And what is that? Eat, the Zark said. Great quantities of high-energy foods. It shuddered at the thought of Albert overloading his digestive tract any more than he had been doing the past week. But Albert's reaction went to prove that, while their relationship was physically close, mentally they were still far apart. Albert, the Zark noted in astonishment, didn't regard it as an ordeal at all. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the cosmos, brought to you by Wordsmith Soundscapes, immersive sci-fi tales and beyond. If you enjoyed this story, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to explore new worlds, thrilling adventures, and boundless imagination. Have a favorite sci-fi classic or an idea you'd like to hear? Drop it in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, dream boldly, imagine fearlessly, and keep exploring the stars.